Joining us today is Danielle Ritsema. She is a registered social worker and psychotherapist practicing in Sault Ste. Marie since 2012. Her counseling practice primarily focuses on helping women heal from hurt and loss and improve their mental health and relationships. Welcome, Danielle. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in women's mental health.
So it's a bit of a long story, actually, so I will try to keep it concise because I don't want to take up the whole interview talking about me. And people in the Sioux always want to know how I got here, who I'm related to, and who I am, really. So those are the things that I'll really focus on. So I am a registered social worker, psychotherapist, like you said, and I'm not actually from the Sioux. So my husband and I moved here about 7 years ago for him to pursue a different career path, actually. We both have extended family in other areas of Northern Ontario and always thought we might end up in Northern Ontario because we love canoeing and hiking and backcountry camping. And so this is where we landed and where we're putting down roots. Since then, we've had 3 beautiful children, age 5, 2, and 11 months. And we've made some amazing friends who now we consider our chosen family here. And so professionally, how I came to work in women's mental health and social work as a field, it's been a lifelong journey. So as a child, I was actually really creative, and I loved singing and theater, and I thought that that's what I would do until I was actually well into high school. And at that point, I realized that my life was meant for something different. And so I won't share a lot, but my mom actually was adopted as an infant and experienced a lot of trauma early on. And if you know about trauma, you know that that has a ripple effect across generations. And so many people in my family have struggled with mental illness and substance use, suicide, sexual assault. So unfortunately, I had a lot of indirect and direct experience with those things at an age where I didn't have the skills to cope with it, and I didn't understand it. My mom's story is not mine to tell, so I won't go into more details, but it absolutely has shaped who I am and what I do now. And my sister and I are very close, and she did give me permission to share a little bit about her story because she unfortunately did experience sexual assault at a young age. And I know there's lots of women out there who have, and the justice system just isn't really sufficient for that issue. And so I feel very strongly about that I know there's lots of women out there struggling with that who haven't been able to tell their story, who've carried that wound throughout their life and haven't been able to really heal from it because the justice system isn't there. And as a society, we just haven't known how to handle it, I think, in a helpful way for women. So that's an area that really has been important to me in my development as a social worker. And so into high school, I discovered and really, with the help of a few counselors, actually, I saw a social worker at one point who told me I should write a story or a book. And I thought it was helpful in her affirming my experiences, but also unhelpful in making me feel uniquely messed up. like my story was so interesting that it could be a book. And so I feel like that's really informed my approach with clients too, to help them understand that their story, while unique to them, they're not alone. You know, there's lots of women who have struggled as well, and they're not uniquely messed up. There's ways that our minds work and relationships work and ways that we can make changes and heal. And so I went on to university. I went into psychology. my way of dealing with stress is to understand everything I possibly can about the situation, to try to find a solution. So I just really delved into studying the mind and relationships, and actually had thought I would go into research, but found that I really liked the applied side better. I wanted to use research to help people make change. And so I went into the Masters of Social Work program, met some amazing people and professors, and then from there entered healthcare, and have worked with a lot of different people throughout the years since 2010. So.
Wow, that I want to acknowledge like the incredible journey that you've been on, and thank you so much for sharing openly about your experiences. And I think a lot of women will be able to relate to what you've shared, because trauma is something that is more common than people probably realize. And it's not until we start communicating about this more openly, when we feel safe and we've worked on healing that trauma, that we can really see those common threads between us. And I also think it's so amazing of you that you really took something that could be quite a painful situation that could keep you stuck and maybe repeating some patterns in your family, and instead you turned it into a passionate pursuit for your career. It's amazing.
Absolutely, thank you. It was something actually I was really afraid of, because I understood that that pattern could repeat. And I remember saying to a therapist at one point, I think it was during my undergraduate degree, what if what if I'm the same way? And she said to me, the key thing is that you're choosing not to. And there's a quote that I remember hearing actually not that long ago, but I really loved it. And it was, if you're not changing, you're choosing. Mm-hmm. And it really affirmed that belief that I had, really from that therapist that helped me come to that idea that I can choose a different path, that it's not inevitable that that's going to repeat. And so I've had to really challenge those fears around that too. And definitely having my sister kind of walking through this journey with me has been incredibly important too in that healing process for myself.
For sure. Our social connections really matter quite a bit. And I'd like to hear more from you. If you could tell us about the connection between mental health and our relationships.
Absolutely. So, part of the reason I love the field of social work and what I do is the emphasis that it puts on relationships. We know that as human beings, we're social. We're meant to be connected with other people. Even if you're introverted, you still need to have meaningful, close relationships with other people. And so that sense of belonging and that worthiness is so key. I just was listening to a podcast recently about a study Julianne Holt-Lunstad had done on loneliness, and she actually found that the mortality rate was similar to people who have smoked 15 cigarettes a day. So loneliness really is so damaging to our health in general, but to your mental health, I think it's so key. Early on, we have these important relationships with our caregivers, and that really impacts us, I think, and a lot of researchers would agree, throughout our lives in terms of how we relate to other people and how we process and regulate our emotions. So it really is important.
Yeah, I don't think that, the connection between our mental health and relationships can really be overstated. I think it is so critical, and you've pointed that out, and the research definitely supports that. Who are the typical clients or patients that you might see in your practice?
So like I said, I've worked in a variety of settings, but there are certain areas that I think I'm passionate about based on what I've already even talked about and things that I've just been led to. So early on, I worked in a hospital setting, and so healthcare has always been really interesting to me. I've always been interested, how that impacts mental health and vice versa, that reciprocal kind of relationship. And so people who are struggling with physical illness, chronic health issues, chronic pain, terminal illness, death. And then I've also always worked with moms. In my undergraduate degree, I worked volunteering at a teenage mom's school program, so I helped take care of their babies, and it got me really interested in helping them. And So I went on to work in a postpartum depression group at the hospital, and I've worked with a lot of women over the years who struggled with miscarriage, infertility, and prenatal and postpartum mental health issues. So really my clients, their issues that they come in to talk to me about really span a lot of things, but the patterns, tend to become very similar. We struggle as women to wear all these hats, and we struggle with this idea that we should do it perfectly and that we should be strong. And I think culturally there's been so much pressure on women, not to show our emotions and not to appear weak because we can do what a man does. And I think it's important for us to really challenge that notion, because what it ends up doing is really forcing us to cut off from our emotions, to put up these protective barriers which prevent us from really having meaningful, healthy relationships with people and with ourselves, and really losing who we are and how we feel about things, which really isn't helpful. So I tend to see a lot of women who've come to this place where they don't even know how they feel. A lot of them are physically ill, but there isn't always necessarily a physiological source for that illness either, or that pain. And oftentimes we start kind of going through the layers of their history and their current situation, and there's a lot of hurt there, and loss and wounds. And I find helping them find healing and work through those and find better skills for processing things emotionally results in a lot better health overall for the person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I see really commonly in my practice, that our mental and emotional well-being can really influence our physical health and vice versa. So it's really important to be working from all those angles. What are some common obstacles that women who you might work with in your practice might be struggling with around hurt and loss?
So like I said, I think there's a lot of cultural pressure on women to be strong and get things done, even in really great relationships where the partners are, a team. It often falls on the mom to carry the burden of, making decisions about childcare and their children and household tasks, even when they've got a really busy career as well, or other family responsibilities. And it just becomes a lot for women to manage. And I think that really is a cultural pattern that we have to challenge, and really prioritizing self-care and making sure you know what your needs are and recognizing when they're not being met.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to think about, what's the obstacle, but then also what's the solution on the other side of it. What would you say are current health practices that you might recommend for working through hurt or loss with women?
I think being intentional about doing the work needed. So often we get used to these routines and these patterns, and we don't stop until our body literally stops, or something else kind of just puts the brakes on for us, until we're forced to stop and look at things. And so I think making the choice, the intentional decision to work through things, to pay attention to how you're feeling. I know for myself, that was something that was really key for me in dealing with past hurts, but also moving forward to build up my resilience, was developing those skills, meditating, doing yoga, doing mindful activities, mindful walks, really paying attention to how my body feels and recognizing, because often that's the first clue that something's off physically. You feel that kind of pit in your stomach or that tension somewhere. That is your first kind of sign or hint that something's not quite in balance and you need to address something.
Yeah, I think it's really important to tune in and have that self-awareness about how we're feeling, and even physical sensations that could tell us more about maybe how our mental health has shifted. I think that's really great to hear. How would you say that experiencing hurt or loss and carrying those feelings affects our relationships?
So I think it, like I said, early on, we develop these patterns that can carry through into adulthood even. And ongoing, experiences shape our minds. They shape how we cope with the changing environment around us. And so positive relationships add, it's almost like a tank that you're filling up. And so when you have meaningful interactions with people, you feel filled up. You feel like I belong. I'm worthy. I'm valued. There's a place for me in this world. And when you don't have those kinds of connections, you feel like I'm the only one. There's nobody out there. Does anyone even really care? And so to really develop healthy relationships, which really involves a lot of skills that we don't necessarily learn, especially if the family that we've grown up in hasn't had those healthy patterns either. It's difficult to really know how to communicate your needs, and in a way that isn't blaming or criticizing or defensive.
Right. So adapting and learning new skills is something that is really important, because we might have learned perhaps some maladaptive ways of coping with feelings of hurt or loss, which can, have a negative effect on our relationships.
Mm-hmm. And even your thoughts and emotions that you've, those cognitive kind of patterns that you develop over the years based on what you're surrounded by. I mean, we know that the brain develops based on the stimulus it's given. And so if you are told something over and over again, you believe it, and it can become an internalized message that's really hard to challenge unless you actually, identify it and start working to challenge it with different kinds of beliefs and different information. But it takes time. It's like a skill. I always say to my clients that, if you've never run anywhere except maybe, to the bathroom once, if you decided you were going to run a marathon, you couldn't jump off your couch and go run a marathon. That would not go well for you. You'd get hurt and you'd be incredibly sick. You have to train for that. And in the same way, we have to train our minds to change the way that they work, to rewire those neural pathways so that they function in a healthier, better way. And that takes a long time, and it can feel awkward. It feels like deciding to exercise or deciding to start running. It's painful at first and it's awkward, and you don't do it very well. But over time, we all have the capacity to change in significant ways.
That's an excellent analogy. I think that really sums up what that experience of doing that very important inner work on our own mental, emotional health is really like. So thank you for sharing that. So as women, we might have a tendency to minimize our feelings, and others may minimize our feelings as well. So I'm wondering if you can define what loss might look like in a woman's life, because this might be different for different people and it might not be acknowledged.
Yeah, and I think the reason that I phrase it as loss, I think, is because so often we don't think of things. We think of like, well, or we do this comparison. We think, well, they've experienced this, their husband died, or they lost their child. Like, that's horrifying. So my loss somehow is less meaningful or less hurtful or painful because their loss is so significant. It really isn't about that. They're both significant. David Kessler is a grief and death researcher and writer, and he said that the worst loss is your own. Your own loss is always the worst loss because it's your own, and it's not less significant because of someone else's. So when I talk about loss, it's about loss of relationship, which they might not have died. You might just not have a relationship with that person, and that's a significant loss in your life. It could be a loss of a dream for whatever reason, whether it's something situational that's happened to you or because of someone else's actions. But losing that dream, it could be the loss of someone physically, them dying. It could be the loss of a pet, which is a significant source of support for a lot of people. It could be the loss of, like I said, of a relationship. It could be like a divorce, or it could be another kind of death that we don't always think of when we think of death, like stillborn or miscarriages, which often I know A lot of women have verbalized that, and people have said, you know, well, now you can have another one, or you can, you know, like you move on and think of the next baby that you're going to have, or and you don't. They're all so complicated, those losses, and especially the ones where there isn't necessarily one of those. What's the word I'm looking for? A communal kind of experience, like a funeral. We don't have funerals for people who go through divorce. We don't have funerals for people who are estranged from their fathers. We don't have funerals for miscarriages. And those are really significant losses in people's lives that tend not to get spoken about even sometimes. And women are carrying those wounds around without being able to speak about them and experience their grief.
I think it's an important differentiation between something that someone might go through solo as an individual, or versus what it might look like if it was like social and socially acceptable to share, or socially acceptable to like grieve together, which is quite a different experience. Again, coming back to the importance of our social connections.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those examples. I think a lot of women will relate to those experiences. Now, you know, speaking of stress, how might women who are working on improving their mental health adapt their self-care practices in times of high stress?
Well, like I was saying with that analogy on running, I think developing these skills and practicing them during times where you're not significantly stressed or you're not under stress is really important, because it makes it much more natural and easier for your mind really to use those strategies, and even your body to use them naturally. When we're in a fight or flight stress response, when our body and our mind switches into that survival mode, it doesn't work very effectively. We tend to shift our attention quickly. We don't remember things. And part of that is sort of this primal animal response that helps us if we're actually being chased by a predator. But it doesn't always help us to cope emotionally, especially long term. So I've had women too who are under a significant amount of stress who are worried that they have like memory loss, especially if you're older. And I work in a family health team where we would do memory testing and assessments, and we had people come in who we identified that we think that the source of your memory issues are actually stress. Finding things that are slower, simpler kinds of tasks you can do that really focus on the basics, you know, breathing, walking, just slowing down can be so helpful, and really helping train your mind and body to process things a little more effectively.
Yeah, I think it often comes back to those fundamentals, because we often don't get enough rest in our society, not enough sleep, and not enough, you know, rest throughout a day. Everything is about go, 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 and very like fast paced. So I think it's so important to reconsider those foundations and putting in pauses in your day to really, you know, just be.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned sleep, because that's a huge, huge piece that too often we don't think about either as being so important in our regular routine. We just notice when we're stressed that we can't sleep. You know, I call it the hamster wheel, just goes, goes, goes. It doesn't go anywhere. It just won't stop. So yeah, absolutely things like that, and making sure you're going to bed at consistent times, getting up at the same time, and having, you know, eating healthy things. We don't even understand fully how much nutrition affects us physically and mentally, but we know that it's really important. And then having those relationships, having those people that you can trust, that you already have a solid foundation between the two of you of understanding that you can share about some of your struggles, and having those things already in place so that before the stress comes, you're in a better place to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for elaborating on that. So resilience is something that you've already mentioned, and it's also one of my favorite topics to talk about. And it's also something that is really important for women's wellness. So could you tell me, what does becoming more resilient mean to you, and how does it relate to the women that you treat?
Resilience is so important, and I think that's one of the things that we initially connected on when I started seeing your social media posts was resilience, because it's always been an interest of mine. Why do some people overcome struggles and obstacles? What is it that they're doing or that they have done that helps them bounce back from stress or process through it and move beyond it and become stronger people? I don't think you can ever say, I'm thankful that this bad thing happened to me, but you hear a lot of people say, I'm thankful for what I've learned or who I've become because of it. And I feel absolutely the same way, that I know I wouldn't be the person I am today without the struggles I've had. Not that I'm thankful for those at all, but I'm absolutely thankful for the resilience that I have. And I definitely, like 100%, give a lot of credit to some amazing people that came into my life. And now knowing what I do know, having done the research I've done and learned what I have, I know how important, again, those relationships are to children and youth. A positive adult relationship can be hugely protective. And simple statements that I'm sure some of the people in my life didn't realize. I mean, there was the counselor statement that I mentioned about the book that was helpful in a way and not helpful in another way, but other people who've come into my life, a music teacher that I can think of, a couple friends, moms who would say things or encourage me or support me, made a huge difference in me developing that resilience. And then, of course, like I said, my sister, having her support throughout my life, knowing where we've been and where we are now. And so I find in my clients' lives too, having those key people who are there for them, cheering them on, supporting them, and then also, really doing the other things, like I said, being intentional, doing the work, seeing a therapist if you need to see a therapist. Just because you go once doesn't mean you're uniquely messed up, like I said, and it doesn't mean you'll be going the rest of your life, but that one session could be incredibly important. Going to the yoga class, doing the breathing exercises, eating healthy, or making a change in your life, changing where you are in your career or what kind of career you have, or the relationships you have, doing those changes, recognizing when you need to make a change and choosing that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your take on that. And thank you so much today, Danielle, for all the wisdom that you shared and your experience, your story. I think that, what you shared today is no doubt going to have a positive impact on so many women.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.